everyone. I'm so excited to see so many people in the room with us today. Before you see my face, this is Ladek talking to you. I just want to put this teaser out there that you need to save the date for Innovation 2022. I'm really excited that at the end of this presentation by Michael Vaughn that you're going to be having coming up here, our executive director, Phil Miller, is going to be talking about what this in-person event is going to be all about and how exciting it is for all of us. But hi, I am Ladek. I am the principal of eLearn Advocacy here at OpenLMS. Hooray, I got the finger correct this time so that we can, I pointed the correct logo there. But I want to welcome you all. This is a really important day for us at OpenLMS, for people in education generally, for anybody who does online learning, really just sort of, I guess, everybody in the world. It's Global Accessibility Day. And what does that mean? Global Accessibility Day means this is a day to celebrate, how do we make education available, inclusive, equanimous, lots of great words that I know that Michael is going to be talking about here in just a few minutes. So I want to bring him onto the stage with me right now. Hello, Michael. How are you today?
Doing pretty well. How about you?
I am fantastic. Michael, I'm going to take 2 seconds to introduce you. And you are, obviously, you're one of my colleagues here at OpenLMS. You are a customer support specialist. But, more importantly, you have been in this business in instructional design and instructional technology for a long time. You are an LMS administrator, and you have been working in training. You've been working in support. You've been working in design. You've been working in education. Is there anything that you haven't done in the online education universe? I don't know.
There are a lot of spots filled on that bingo board. Yeah.
I love it. But this is one of the topics that is near and dear to your heart. I know this is something that as a designer, it's something that you've spoken about in many different occasions and something that is really important to you. I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Amy Tessitore in our first session for the Asia Pacific region was, for those people who may not stick around for, at the end of the session or may not be here 45 minutes to an hour from now, what's that single most important thing about accessibility that you want to put on the table for people today?
For me, wow, I have to sum it all up in one. That's an excellent question. I would say, to me, it's not about the laws or the consequences associated with making sure that your content is accessible for others. I think it's ultimately about what are the characteristics, what are the traits that we want to embody personally, and how do we express that through the concepts of course design and development, and how do we develop educational materials that also embody those principles that we're trying to live by.
Fantastic. Let's see how that plays out in your presentation. I offer you the stage. Your presentation is already loaded up, so let me get you running correctly, and we'll see you in a little while. Just want to remind everybody, this is live. This is something that could be interactive if you so choose. I see some comments coming in right now. We do see everything. If you're joining us on YouTube right now, please put your observations, your comments, your questions, your challenges, your successes in there around accessibility, and Michael will either be happy to address them or we'll take them as questions later. Ciao.
All right, sounds good. I'm going to turn off my webcam just to make sure that things stay nice and smooth for us while we're going through here. If you do have questions, please toss those in the chat. I unfortunately won't be able to see them, but my colleagues will, so they'll be able to hop in and let me know that you have a really important question that you'd love to talk about. So when it comes to sessions on accessibility, on inclusive course design, things like that, there is an ongoing challenge associated with those sessions, which is it's hard to do them well, right? I've seen a lot of different approaches to sessions like this. Some focus really heavily on the laws and the consequences. Some focus really on, let's say interactive pieces with simulated impairments, which, I get the spirit of those sessions. They always make me feel a little uncomfortable, though, because it's almost like you're playing disabled, and it feels a little, the word that I use is squicky. It doesn't quite feel right to me to be in sessions like that. I've seen sessions on universal design, sessions on universal design for learning, sessions just on traditional accessibility, and there are challenges that come along with all of those. In general, I'm not sure that I've seen it done super well just yet, so I want to take a slightly different approach, because every single time I've been in a session like that, and I'm willing to bet this is not your first session on accessible course design or accessible learning materials design, every single person who's led that training session for you probably said you should just be incorporating accessibility by default. And usually that comes up because accessibility seems to be a very reactive thing, especially, most of my background is in higher ed. In higher ed, it does feel especially reactive. It's, oh, all of a sudden I've just gotten this letter from our student accessibility services office that says I've got a student who has a hearing impairment and now I need to caption all of my videos. Or, I have a student who, let's say, has a visual impairment, and now I need to go through with all of those images that I've added into my course and make sure that there are very descriptive captions and alternative text. And the simple fact of the matter is, if I could steal this viral tweet from a couple of weeks ago, accessibility isn't really extra steps. It's just steps that we've missed along the way. And I would wonder, why do we miss those steps? If we're trying to build materials for learners, if we want learners to be successful as a starting point, how do we end up missing those things? So there are 3 things I want you to keep in mind as a starting point for this session. And the first is that our own personal abilities really do define our sense of what's normal to us. And this session is given from a pretty privileged perspective because I'm making a lot of assumptions about you. I'm assuming that you are watching this, that you don't have some sort of visual impairment, and that you're participating in this session because you want to help others gain better access to instructional activities, to materials, to courses that you are developing, even if they are living with impairments that might otherwise keep them from those things. So that's a bit of a privileged perspective that I get to assume that. What this means also is that if you do have a disability or an impairment and it's very well managed, it becomes functionally invisible to you. And the example that I like to give is I accidentally, about 4 months ago, I was putting our daughter into the car. I got her in the car seat. I couldn't hold multiple things at once. So I put my glasses in my glasses case on top of the car, put our daughter into the car seat, and I drove off, and only later realized that my glasses had been on top of the car the whole time. When I got back home, realized that I had also run them over with my car. Now, I was very fortunate. I had a prescription pair of sunglasses that I was able to wear for a little bit, but I'm required to wear glasses to drive. I am legally not allowed to operate a motor vehicle without that. That's how poor my vision is without corrective lenses or corrective contacts. So that is an impairment. That's a visual impairment that I live with every day. But because my glasses work so well, and because, since I was 10 years old, when I've had glasses, that was the first pair of glasses I had ever managed to destroy. My impairment is so well managed that I don't even think about myself as being visually impaired. Right? So our personal abilities do define our sense of what's normal to us. Because of that, it is really easy for us to overlook people who are outside our zone of normal. It's very easy to overlook others who aren't like us. And not only that, the third thing, we disproportionately tend to focus on those observable impairments, which means that we miss folks along the way who are dealing with invisible impairments or things that might be much harder to directly observe. And this is kind of an ongoing mistake that we make by overly focusing on observable impairments. Because if you look at, the most obvious impairments out there tend to be physical impairments. Those physical impairments actually only represent about 7% of all impairments and disabilities that exist in that community. And that leaves about 93% of folks in the disabled community out of that consideration. In higher ed, the 2 that we tend to focus on, and learning experiences, the 2 that we tend to focus on are hearing impairments and visual impairments. And that makes a lot of sense. We do want to make sure that especially our digital content is as accessible as possible to folks who are living with visual or hearing impairments, right? And I will actually talk about 2 different strategies, both to make content more accessible for learners with visual impairments and for learners with auditory impairments. But the cool thing is, when you accommodate those types of impairments, you actually start to open up your coursework to even more learners that go well beyond that. So it's not like you're doing quote unquote extra work for 1 or 2 students. The work that you do up front to make your content as accessible as possible actually helps a broad range of people that you may never even know that you impact, because there are so many different types of disabilities and impairments out there. Things like chronic pain conditions like fibromyalgia, mental and emotional disorders like anxiety, generalized depression, bipolar disorder, things like that. Even something as simple as a physical impairment that might make someone feel uncomfortable, like hyperhidrosis, just folks who sweat a lot for really no good reason. It just happens. These are all sorts of different impairments and disabilities that are very easy to miss. Now, I recognize that we have quite a few folks joining from the corporate world, from the nonprofit world, from volunteer organizations and things like that. But generally speaking, those organizations don't tend to collect a lot of data about impairments related to their colleagues and their employees. But where we do see a lot of data collected tends to be in higher education. So if a student has some sort of learning impairment, say, they can register with their Student Disabilities Resources or Accessibility Resources office on their campus and request accommodations for the impairment within the learning environment. And what we know nationally speaking across data from the US and Canada is about 1 in 5 students are actually registered or have a registered disability or impairments with their Disabilities Resources Office. So 20% of all learners out there in higher ed. And it's not like these impairments and disabilities magically disappear once these students graduate and they enter the working world. Um, it would probably surprise no one to learn that the majority of these impairments are not necessarily for visual impairment or hearing impairment, but are actually for learning disorders and for mental and emotional disorders that are related typically to test taking environments. One of the most common accommodations that we make for students in higher ed is extended test time, and typically in a quieter testing environment. So that's something to keep in mind, right? Because we tend to overlook that a bit. Or I've even seen some instructors who are just outright dismissive of some of these learning impairments. They think that's a bit overblown, or it's very easy to look at certain conditions like, let's say, ADHD and say, oh, you have trouble focusing. Everyone has trouble focusing, without understanding properly that it's not necessarily the symptom, it's the severity and the impact on their day-to-day life. And it's not just that they might be registered with their Disabilities Resources Office for test accommodations for one condition. Typically, these students experience something called significant comorbidity, which means that if they're living with one condition, they are very often living with another. So folks with anxiety are very likely to also, from time to time, be experiencing bouts of depression or persistent bouts of depression. Anxiety is also a very common comorbidity for ADHD. And that middle place there is where a lot of learners live, even though we might be focusing on just one or two aspects of their life that makes things very challenging for them. So one of the things that you'll hear me talk about today are some of those invisible impairments. I like to focus a lot on depression and anxiety since those are universal experiences, but they can have a pretty serious impact on the lives of students who live with them chronically. What we know from research is about 64% of all higher education students in the US and Canada reported feeling overwhelming anxiety over the past year. That number is probably not too surprising since there's still we've started year 3 of a pandemic, and it's very stressful to go through so much change. If you think about the first years who started college in fall 2020 have never known a non-pandemic semester, right? So it's only now that you might be seeing a somewhat quote unquote return to normalcy on campuses. If you were to look up something like depression on a stock photo site, and one of my favorite stock photo sites is pexels.com. It's spelled like pixels, but with an E. I love this site because all the photos are Creative Commons 0, which means they've been released directly into public domain. So I can use them for free. And if I forget the attribution at some point, which I do try and include, then it won't be a big deal because, quite frankly, it's public domain at that point. So I'm not risking getting my employer in legal trouble by using any of the images here. But I searched for the word depression on this site to see what stock photos come up. And it is what you would stereotypically expect. A lot of people looking away from the camera, people looking sad, a lonely coffee mug, an empty road, someone playing the guitar forlornly. And, these are the stereotypical images that we think of when we think of what does depression look like. But the thing is, depression can also look like this. It's very easy to overlook the fact that people who are living with depression or anxiety or learning disorders or chronic health issues, these are not people who are incapable of experiencing joy or happiness or other positive emotions. They aren't just the conditions that they live with, right? They are full-fledged human beings, and they're capable of full and fulfilling lives. The trick is we don't always make space for people who aren't, let's say, like us. Like if we aren't living with those conditions, we don't always think to make space for people who are. So one area where I tried to create a little bit of a simulation of what this was like was basically a money spending game where folks had a particular budget that they would spend on different actions throughout the day. And they would have a different budget depending on whether or not they were living with different conditions. So if they were role-playing as a student who had anxiety, they would have a specific type of budget. If they were role-playing as a student with ADHD, they would have a specific type of budget. And they would have to make decisions and compromises throughout the day without going over budget. And this was really based on an idea called the spoon theory that came out in 2003 from Christine Miserandino. And Christine lives with chronic pain. It's a chronic condition. It does not go away. It affects her life on a daily basis. And her friends generally just did not understand it. So when she was at lunch one day, the way she tried to explain it was she took all the spoons at the table and she laid them in front of her. And she said, let's pretend you start the day with 10 spoons. And you decide to do the dishes. That costs you 1 spoon, but me doing the dishes might cost me 4 spoons. So if you think about it through a financial lens instead, that tends to be a little bit easier. So pretend like you have a budget of, let's say, $10 a day. And it might cost, just your average everyday person $1 to do the dishes. But someone with a chronic pain condition might cost them $4 or $5 to work up to do the dishes because it's so difficult. And I will point out one of the most common disabilities for folks over the age of 60 in the US is arthritis, right? A significant number of Americans live with that condition. So these are things that are easy to miss, but they do have a really big impact. Building on this, there's a really interesting concept out there called ego depletion. And I will say that there is a little bit of controversy surrounding this research. But assuming it holds up, what it means is that willpower is generally thought to be an exhaustible resource. So that's why they usually tell you if you're going to do something big, do it in the morning, right? Some of you, like me, we overfocus on appointments. So if you ever schedule a dentist appointment for me at 2 p.m., I am going to be just I'm going to focus on it all day long. I'm going to think about it literally from the moment that I wake up until 2 p.m. rolls around. I like to do those things in the morning because that way it's not on my mind anymore. But you may also notice that towards the end of the day, you might have woken up that morning, you're like, I'm going to do the dishes. And you get home and you're like, I'm tired. I don't want to do it. I don't have it in me right now. And that's what we're talking about with ego depletion. And this might not be too surprising to learn, but stressful situations tend to cost more of your willpower than others. So if you are in a stressful situation, it takes much more out of you. You may have noticed that self-care becomes a lot more difficult after you've had a fight or an argument with someone who's really important to you. That's a great example of ego depletion and stressful situations costing more. So the gist of this is that the energy required to do the same task can be very different depending on the burdens each individual person is living with. So if I bring you back to that quote that I said at the beginning, every instructional designer or instructional technologist or whoever's led sessions on accessible design that you've gone to before has almost certainly said you should just be incorporating accessibility by default. And I will be honest, it's hard to do that if you don't have a good lens for what that looks like. And the lens is not what are the laws and how do I make sure that we don't get sued. The lens isn't let me put on glasses that have Vaseline smeared on them so I could see what it might be like to navigate my site with a visual impairment. I think the lens is just design and characteristics of design that we want to embody personally, professionally, and in the materials and courses that we create. If you ask the question, what is design for? Design is usually for getting things to users as easily as possible, which is why I always thought this image was, maybe just a one-off, but every single time I go to a pharmacy or drugstore, I always check this just to be sure. And without fail, every CVS, every Walgreens, every Rite Aid that I've ever gone into, they always put the back pain medicine on the bottom 2 shelves. And that is just bad design, right? When folks come in and they need that, what they need is they need that at like eye level height or shoulder level height so that they can just reach out, grab it, and not have to bend down to get this stuff. So design is about making sure that it's easy for people to get things that they need. Design is also for communicating ideas as clearly as possible to users so that they have an idea of what the expectations for them are and what they should be doing along the way, what happens next, what's already happened, right? Design is very much about clearly communicating ideas and concepts to users. So if we're thinking about what does design do in the grand scheme of things, especially when we apply it to an educational context, design simplifies choice. So we're not overwhelming our users. They did a really interesting study on analysis paralysis, which means there are too many options, so you have difficulty even making a choice. It was a simple study on jams in a store. So they put out a display that had 26 different jams, and they put out a display that had, I think, 4 or 5. And the display that had 4 or 5 sold significantly more because it was much easier for people to make a choice. When you give them too many choices, it becomes really, really difficult to figure out what to do. So simplifying choice is really important in learning environments as well. It provides direction to the users so that they know where they are and where they are going next, and ideally where they've been as well. And in general, it just reduces the burden. So I'm not going to talk about laws. I'm not going to talk about universal design for learning or accessibility. What we are going to talk about as an overwhelming message is how do we reduce the burden on users, on learners, so that when they are going through our courses, when they are engaging with educational materials that we create, how do we reduce the burden for them to make it as easy as possible for them to find the things that they need and engage in with the content in a way that is very likely to not be overwhelming. Right. And I know I mentioned depression and anxiety as conditions earlier. It doesn't just have to be those two. It could be a student living with autism, a hearing impairment, ADHD, chronic pain conditions like fibromyalgia, neurological conditions like MS, gastrointestinal issues like Crohn's disease that have a really big impact on day-to-day life. Right. We're talking about how do we reduce the burden for those folks, because usually when you reduce the burden for one person or group of people, it also reduces the burden for everyone. So I know earlier I had shared this tweet, accessibility isn't extra steps, it's steps you've missed. What are those steps that we've missed along the way? How do we keep ourselves from missing those steps? And I think that there are 4 characteristics of design that if we apply as filters, as lenses over the things that we create, will do a much better job of helping reduce the burden for learners and making our content more accessible. Now, those 4 characteristics are context, compassion, clarity, and consistency. So context, compassion, clarity, and consistency. I'd like to take a deeper dive into each of these and give you some examples of where they might apply in a learning environment. And from time to time, I will be hopping out of the slides, going over to a browser and showing you some things there that I've built to give you an example of what I'm talking about. So the first characteristic is context. And context is the information between the information. If you are someone who lives with ADHD, or you know someone who has an ADHD diagnosis, one thing that you may have noticed that they like to do is start a conversation in the middle, right? They've already started the conversation in their head, and they are now inviting you into it. And that context is usually what's missing in those situations. That can be really hard for folks with ADHD because they're already halfway through an idea, and other folks just need to be caught up on what we're actually talking about. Now, I know you see some herbs and spices on the screen right now. The reason I put that here is when we think of context as the information between the information, a couple of years ago, I took a real interest in cooking, and I learned more and more, picked up more recipes. Turns out I really enjoyed it. I really enjoy cooking. I really enjoyed making food for other people. And as I started to share food with other people, they would be like, wow, this is so good. Like, this tastes amazing. And I'll be honest, I felt a little guilty. I didn't necessarily feel pride. I felt a little guilty because 9 times out of 10, when folks were saying like, oh, this tastes so good, it was one of these things on screen that was actually what tasted good. So it was salt, It was garlic. It was an aromatic like rosemary. It was a fat like butter or heavy cream. It was an acid like lemon juice or balsamic vinegar, right? It wasn't necessarily anything that I did. It was one of these ingredients. And what I really want to emphasize about these ingredients is they are disgusting. Like, you would not sit down and eat a raw clove of garlic. You would not sit down and eat a tablespoon of butter. You wouldn't scoop a tablespoon of salt into your mouth and eat it like that. That's gross, right? But the interesting thing is when you work these into a recipe in moderation, all of a sudden they take all the other flavors in the dish and they dramatically enhance them. So I think of these things as sort of the context of flavor. What provides additional context to our learners in courses? Now, one of the most obvious examples would be alt text, right? When you add an image in Moodle, you are actually prompted to describe that image for someone who cannot see it. And that's the alt text, the alternative text that a screen reader can read out loud to that student. Now, one thing that you may not have noticed, and this will be really hard to see on here, even if you do not have a visual impairment, is that you are limited to 125 characters for that description. I know that they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and that is true. Images hold a tremendous amount of information, and what we know from current neuroscience research is that about half of our brain is devoted either directly or indirectly just to processing visual information, which is incredible. That's why we're really good at it. That's why I could show you an image of, a college campus cafeteria, and you would probably be able to discern what time of day it is, what season it is based off of the clothing that the students are wearing, which meal of the day it is. You might be able to guess the region based off of the cuisine, right? Like if I'm seeing cornbread on plates, I'm going to guess that it's probably, an Atlantic coast or a Southern school. So we have a couple of different options there, but all of that context, all of that information, it's really hard to put that into 125 characters, right? And that's because we have kind of a misunderstanding of what alt text actually does. So what does alt text do? Again, behind the scenes, what it is a little bit of text the screen reader can read to a learner who cannot see or cannot see very well at all. So this is text that you enter so that the image is described. I used to do a little experiment with folks when we would do this session live and in person. I would ask them to describe this image using alt text. Like, what would you type for this image? And we would get all sorts of responses. Some folks would say it's a blue bird graphic facing to the right, or it's a bird that is currently tweeting and flying. And in terms of alt text, I would just say Twitter. Like, this is the Twitter logo. That's all the alt text needs to be. This image represents Twitter, so Twitter is the alt text. If clicking that shared whatever the thing was to Twitter, I would include a description of that because at that point it's an action, right? It's an action link. So I would say share this post to Twitter as the alt text or something like that. Or if it's just decorative, I'd type null, N-U-L-L, so that the screen reader would ignore it completely. But we tend to overthink the alt text. We think it has to be this really large thing. But when we're writing alt text, we do need to include a short description, but not very much. If there's text in the image, that should be included. And if it is a link, so if the image is a link that is clicked and it goes somewhere, you should include where that link takes them. I would avoid using image of. Again, Moodle as an example, if you're limited to 125 characters, there are several that you've just given up writing image of. The screen reader already knows that it's an image, right? It's going to naturally just tell the person who's using the screen reader software that it's an image. So you don't have to write that. And you don't have to include descriptions of decorative images. Completely unnecessary. You don't need to include that at all. It's actually just extra fluff if you do, and it can make it more frustrating for someone who's using a screen reader to navigate your site. Now, if you are having trouble, even after all this, coming up with alt text descriptions for images, I'm going to let you in on one of my little secret hacks that I love. If you have an iPad or an iPhone, there is a really cool app from Microsoft called Seeing AI. This is a free app, and what it does is it basically lets you point the camera at things, and it tries to get a general approximation of what the camera's looking at. It has a few different modes in there, so it can try and recognize people. It can read text to you. It can scan barcodes for products, things like that. But it also has a scene feature where it tries to analyze images and tell you what is in that scene. So I have a quick screencast that I recorded on my phone of me uh, using Seeing AI, and this video goes very quickly. It's all going to play out in real time. So I'm going to tell you what's going to happen ahead of time, so it's a little bit easier to spot as we go. Um, it's starting off with me in the Photos app on my phone. I have an image here that I want to provide some alt text for, but I need a little bit of help. So I am going to open that image. I'm going to tap the share icon, and then I'm going to send it to Seeing AI to be analyzed. That part will take about 3 seconds or so, and then Seeing AI will open up a screen that tells me what it thinks it's looking at. So here's what it looks like in real time. And it's that fast, which I really appreciate. So I just need to have the image on my phone or my iPad. I can preview it in there. Now, I recognize that the text is pretty small, so I'm just going to read it out loud. The scene description for this photo is probably a person and a couple of children sitting on a couch with a laptop. So they're not quite sitting on the couch, like, she's sitting at the table. The children are playing in the background by the couch. But this is a very good description. This requires very little change from me to actually be turned into alt text. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, like, that's not a very big description, though. If I'm including this image, I'm expecting, my users who don't have a visual impairment to take a lot out of it. And, 125 characters isn't going to cut it to someone who can't see it. That's where I encourage everyone to include captions with virtually all of their images if they can, especially if that image is meant to convey a significant amount of information or really important information for your course. Alt text is designed to be used sparingly. Longer descriptions would be great as captions, and those captions are what provide context for that image and why you're using that image. If I were to use this photo, the alt text for this photo might be 2 young Black women taking a selfie with a smartphone. That's all that needs to be said for alt text. Really short, just direct description. Like, I don't need to add anything else to that. But to contextualize why I'm using this image in my course, I might write a longer caption to go along with that. And that caption might be like, members of the millennial and Gen Z generations frequently use smartphones to save, document, and share their personal experiences with others. These practices often include capturing selfies, which are photos of themselves. These photos are often taken at places of interest or with others they have a meaningful attachment to. And hopefully you can tell the difference there. So alt text, again, meant to be used very sparingly. Captions providing additional extra context. Now, we are obviously making these accommodations if we have a learner who comes in and has a documented visual impairment, but who else might we be helping by adding this extra context? I talked a little bit earlier about comorbidities, right? Typically, when learners have one condition, they often have another accompanying condition or several additional accompanying conditions. Those comorbidities can be pretty brutal depending on how they're kind of folded in together, and they flex back and forth off of one another. One really common comorbidity for ADHD is an auditory censoring processing disorder. It's basically where, as they're listening to things, the audio just does not come in right. Which is why sometimes if you have ADHD or if you have a friend or a colleague who has an ADHD diagnosis, they may have asked you to repeat yourself several times. They may do things like put the captions on the TV when they watch TV or stream Netflix or something like that, because it makes it a lot easier to have that extra context to be able to see the words while they're hearing the words. Let's take this a step further, because that sounds a lot like captioning and transcripts on videos. Typically we might do this for someone who has a hearing impairment, but captioning and transcripts can be really helpful for someone with ADHD and an auditory processing disorder. So let me show you my very complicated workflow, because this is one of those things that I've gotten the most pushback on working in higher ed. It's like, why do I have to caption my videos? It takes so much time. It's just relentless. And I would argue that it takes very little extra time to put together captions and transcripts for your videos. I want to show you an example of how I've done that for a 5-minute video. And I'm using a very specific niche piece of software that I know many of you probably may not have heard of just yet. It's called Microsoft Word. And it's a really cool piece of software. If you haven't heard of it, I definitely encourage you to check it out. But most businesses and schools probably have access to this. And Word Online in particular has a great feature that is very easy to miss, and it's just buried up in the top corner, and it's the dictate feature. So it was originally designed so that you could just speak into a microphone and Word would translate your speech and turn it into text. But there's that little drop down caret menu there, and in there is a transcribe feature. So, right now I'm just on like the $6 a month. It's not even a premium plan. It's like the personal plan for Office 365, and I get access to this feature. So this gives you the chance to upload an audio file into Word, and it will transcribe it for you. And I can't emphasize just how cool this is, like just how amazing this is to me. Um, if you edit your video pretty much in any video editing software, iMovie, I think Windows Movie Maker still floats around out there, you are able to export just the audio, right? You can export just the audio from a video. And so that's what I did with a screencast that I put together for a client that I was helping out, and exported that audio from the video, uploaded it into Word, and it transcribed the whole thing for me. It transcribes it with timestamps. It can identify multiple speakers. And what's really cool is when I add it to the document, I can add it as just the text. So now I officially have a formal transcript of what I said in basically a platform that is very easy to edit in, that just about all of us are already familiar with. That is going to be very easy for us to touch up. And I'll be honest, it is surprisingly accurate. It is surprisingly accurate. Every time I go through here, I always expect it to be, just a chore to fix this up. And usually it takes me no longer than, about 5-10 minutes to go through and catch, some of the obvious things. One of the other things that I really like is, in this presentation, I'm trying to be a bit more formal and buttoned up and things like that. But if I'm just doing a quick screencast for a client, I'll be a bit more informal, and some uhs and some ums will switch in or slip in there. Word will ignore all of those. It actually takes out all the filler language as well. So if you're a big and it will actually remove those from the transcript as it's transcribing the audio. You can transcribe, I think, up to 300 minutes a month is my recollection. And it does, again, a shockingly good job. So this takes me virtually no time. Once I have the transcript, I can actually copy and paste this into my video streaming service of choice. So if I'm using something like YouTube, I can copy and paste the transcript into the YouTube caption editor, and it will take the transcript and automatically align it with the spoken words within my video. So it is very easy to put something like this together very, very quickly. So I wanted to put this on your radar. It's one of my absolute favorite things out there. Let's see. Let's hop back to the slides because I know we have several more characteristics to go through. Actually, we have 3. But I wanted to make sure that we had time to show some really cool examples for other things. So, don't sleep on Microsoft Word. It is a lot cooler than people think it is. I know people think it's just like this stuffy tool, but there's a lot of really cool stuff in there, especially in Word Online. All right, so that is context, right? Adding extra context to our course materials and to our course can actually be really beneficial for all learners, and not just 1 or 2 that we think would be most or would benefit most from it. The next characteristic was compassion, and what we're talking about really is how do you make yourself more accessible, right? It's easy to focus on the videos that we make, the audio that we record, the websites that we build, when we talk about making education more accessible. But especially over the past 2 years, I think it's become more and more obvious that if there's a way to make ourselves slightly more accessible, even through very small changes, that can have a really big impact on the student experience. One of those things that I do like to point out is, language, when we talk about disabilities and impairments, can be really important. It really is what you say and how you say it. And one of the really simple changes that I encourage folks to implement first is to just reframe some of your wording when you talk about disabilities and impairments, because traditionally this is what I tend to hear the most. They're a disabled student, they're a deaf student, they're an autistic student. And I would encourage you to try and flip that around, like making a conscious effort to flip that around, because I'm willing to bet that you don't want to be known or labeled as just one specific characteristic about you. Right. And so the same goes for folks who are members of the disability community. And a lot of folks just do not want to be defined through their disability, right? They are rich, fulfilling human beings who have, their fully developed lives. And it's really kind of mean to just label someone based off of their impairment and make that the definition of who they are. That can also affect how folks around them view them and how they are treated by others. And I think part of this does come back to that, what I was saying earlier about how it's really easy to overlook people outside of our zone of normal, right? And so I do like to make these callbacks in the presentation because uh, it it really, I'm not saying anyone on this call is a bad person. I don't think I'm a bad person. I make these mistakes all the time, right? But it's making that conscious effort to make sure that when you are in your classroom environment, when you're recording videos, when you're doing live class sessions, that you're making folks feel like they matter, right? That they are a valued member of the class, and that you don't just define them through one or two different things. And not only that, if we take it a step further, because it's easy for us to overlook people outside of our zone of normal, it can also make it harder for us to reach folks when we're not thinking about where they are. Um, I've had students with hearing impairments who sometimes I have to wear a microphone so that they can hear me speak. It's like a little microphone that they take class to class. And I've always hated that accommodation because it put it on the student. Um, what I don't like about that is it becomes the student's responsibility to make sure that the microphone's charged, that they have to take it class to class, that they have to make sure that this expensive piece of equipment doesn't break, right? That always seemed a little off for me. I didn't particularly care for that. But one thing that always drove me a little crazy, especially at, let's say conferences and whatnot, is when, you're in a large group of people and they want to do a Q&A, or they want to grab a comment, and someone will go up to the microphone, and they're known for having a loud voice, and they'll just basically say, no, I don't need the microphone, it's fine. And the key word in that sentence is I don't need the microphone, right? And it is a selfish perspective because you are centering yourself if you're saying that. That basically puts anyone who might be deaf or hard of hearing, or who needs to see your lips when you speak, you basically put them in a spot where now they have to out themselves to you, right? So there are a lot of different situations where we might be overlooking folks that we aren't aware are there, just because, I know that I have a loud voice, so I know that I don't need a microphone, but it turns out someone else needs me to use the microphone. Let me give you another example of that, which is a concept called masking that is very common, especially with students who are autistic. Um, and I'm going to use two terms here that you may or may not have come across. So I want to clarify. Some members of the autistic community, of the ADHD community, will sometimes refer to themselves as neurodivergent. So basically they're diverging from the neurotypical stream, right? And so folks without those conditions, who aren't autistic, who don't have an ADHD diagnosis, those folks are neurotypical, right? So that's what those two terms mean. Masking is a social strategy that a good number of folks living with autism engage in, and really it's not for their benefit, it's more so for the benefit of the people around them, if we're being honest. It is to make neurotypical people feel more comfortable by them hiding their stims. And when I say stims, sometimes folks who have autism, they have physical stims, they have verbal stims, and they suppress those when they are around others. I want to play you a quick video that one user posted to TikTok. They have autism. They talk a lot about autism on their channel, and basically doing a recreation of what it's like being around others and how they have to sometimes excuse themselves so that they can release some of that energy from needing to stim, but not wanting to do it around others. And I did remove the audio from this video because I don't want a copyright violation on our channel. But you can see the physical stim and how they have to release that energy. And honestly, if people were accepting, then they wouldn't need to hide this. They wouldn't need to sneak off to another room to actually release the energy that they need to release in the way that they need to release it. And I think about this a lot when I think about those Zoom rules where it's like, you have to keep your camera on. And I get that folks are frustrated, that so many, of these class sessions over the past 2 years, people are choosing to turn their cameras off. I've even seen punitive measures where it's like, if you don't turn your camera on, you don't get attendance credit for the day, or I'll knock off a letter grade. Um, but if you have a student who engages in masking because they are worried about judgment from others, you're essentially putting them in a really awkward position where they have to make a decision about whether or not they want other people to be able to see them stim, or whether or not they are going to expend the extra energy to prevent themselves from stimming in front of other people. Now, we talked about that ego depletion earlier and how stressful situations cost more. Think about how much energy goes into pretending to not do something socially, right? If you really just feel a compulsive need to shake your hands out or to make a specific noise over and over and over again, you know that you can't do that around others because they're going to judge you or treat you poorly. Uh, that is definitely taking more of those spoons that we were talking about earlier. That takes significantly more energy to pretend to be someone that you aren't completely, because you are worried about judgment, because there is not an environment right now that accepts you. Let me give you another example of where compassion can really be helpful. And that is by just making some simple changes to courses to make it much easier for your users to find things, right? Finding something in a course is a series of decisions. It is, where might this be? Where is it here? Where is it here? Right? Trying to filter down, figure out where things are. If you are trying to find something in a course, it is a series of decisions. So I want to give you something here that I call course versus book. I want to show you the same content, the exact same content presented in two different ways in a course. So I'm going to hop out of here, and I've got a simple course set up here. And this is set up to only show one topic of the course at a time. I just want to scroll down this page. You can see all the content here. This is just, I pulled this from one of our training courses on H5P. So there, you can see that there's a lot of content in here. And I do try and use headings to keep things consistent, right? Definitely helps quite a bit when you're trying to let learners know where things are, but it's a lot of content. There would be a lot of decision making that would go on to try and find something somewhere on this page, because there's so much stuff here compared to the exact same content here. And so I also took that same content, I built it into an H5P interactive book. You could also use the Moodle book resource. I love that one just as much. Interactive book can add in some interactive H5P elements, but in the interactive book, it looks a little bit more like this. So the content is broken into sections with a table of contents that explicitly outlines what is where. You even have subheadings that go into these. So this is the exact same content that we looked at, but in a format that's been broken up so that it has navigation, so that it's easier for our learners to navigate through to figure out where something might be. In other words, we're making those decisions easier for them to make by taking the exact same content and just arranging it in a way that is a little bit more compact, so that you're not looking at too much at once, that you can go through. And even in spots where, let's say there's a video on this last page here, even where you have the option to engage with content. So here's a transcript underneath this video that I also created in Microsoft Word. And this is obviously a lot of text, right? But it's also optional engagement now, because the learner can choose whether or not they actually want to have that visible on the page, or if they just want this. So taking all of that content and building into something simple like a book, this makes your course much easier to scroll through. But B, it also makes it easier for the users, because now they have a table of contents that they can get through. Really dense amounts of information now have structure and now have navigation applied over top of them as a filter, which makes things much easier. So if we're thinking about how do we help folks, essentially what we're doing is we're taking all that content, we're restructuring it to reduce the burden of the decision making. And it essentially just makes easier pathways for folks to actually get to that content, which I really just love that concept of how do we make things easier for people to find them. I love that idea, and that's a really common thing. And honestly, that is a compassionate thing to do. If you have a student who lives with anxiety, and you have not finished your semester yet, how do you think they are feeling right now? Right? Going into finals week, this is a really spike heavy time for anxiety, for depression, for ADHD. It's a very, very difficult time. It's a difficult time even if you're not living with those conditions. So anything you can do to reduce the burden is a compassionate trait in your course design. All right, let's talk a little bit about clarity. And this is really just about, I think this is a good segue to how do we organize the courses a little bit better to make it easier for users to find things. And there are a couple of things that go into that. One is just simplicity in general, right? Taking out all the fluff, things that we don't need in there. There are some strategies that I really love that go along with this, but I kind of compare this to cooking. If you're cooking a meal, you are going to take out all the ingredients you need. You're not going to empty out the entire fridge or the entire spice rack or the entire pantry. You're only going to take out the ingredients that you need. So how do we do the same thing with the courses or the instructional materials that we're using so that we're not overwhelming the learners with too much at once? So there are a few different things that you can do to provide additional direction to learners within the course. Now, sometimes these can be cues that go along with it. To give you an example of a cue that I thought was really clever in instructional materials, and it was actually some students who put this together. They were giving a presentation and they added this bar to the top of their slides, and it showed the section that they had just been in, the section they're in now, and the section that they're going to next. And what I loved about that is it helped orient the content within the larger context of the presentation. I thought it was a really clever way to do that. It was just a very simple cue to let the learners know where they were, where they'd been, and where they're going next. And you can do sort of similar things by just making really simple changes to your course settings, right? You don't even have to completely redesign your course or anything like that. You can just make some simple changes to settings that already exist that will make it a little bit easier for your learners to find things. One is in the course settings, and it's the course layout option. One thing that we really like to do, especially in training, is set it to show one section per page. What that means is that when your users come into the course, they're not scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling through every bit of content in the entire course. And usually what happens is I've seen a lot of instructors add content in chronological order. So at the end of the semester, you're in week 14, 15, 16, and the students have to scroll all the way to the bottom of the course page just to get to the content that's most important right when finals are starting. So we really love show one section per page. That way they can focus on just one section at a time. When they come into the course, it'll have a name for each topic. They can click on the topic that they want to go into, and then it'll show all the content for that specific topic. Is this great for folks using a screen reader? Yeah. Is it great for folks with anxiety or ADHD? Also, yeah. Is it great for students who don't even live with any of those conditions or impairments? Also, yes. So this is an example of how a simple change can help one group a lot, but ultimately helps everyone as well. There's another thing that I really love to do in courses, and that's add a block called the activities block, right? I was talking a little bit earlier about how do we add some filters over our content to help the learners find what they're looking for faster. And the activities block is great at this. So if you've never used this before, I would encourage you to give it a look. Essentially what it does is it looks at all the content and all the resources in your course, and it creates specialized pages just for that particular activity type or resource. So if they were to click assignments in the activities block, they would see a list of all of your assignments in the course, which toward the end of the semester, if they're supposed to submit a first draft of their final paper and they can't find the assignment, that's stressful, right? All of a sudden, we've got that ego depletion. We've got them using up more and more of their mental resources, trying to figure out where something is because there's too much stuff on the page. The activities block means that they can click assignments, they can scroll through a list of just the assignments in the course, makes it much more likely that they're going to find what they're looking for faster. This also comes down to things like giving directions, right? One of the biggest challenges that I remember having at a school that was like really big on study abroad was when you would have students who were studying at the school who were from the UK. You would try and explain, okay, the office is on the second floor, and they would come back and say like, what do you mean there's no second floor? And that's because the first floor in the UK is actually the ground floor, right? And the first floor is actually the second floor, and so it kind of goes up like that. So we're telling folks to go to the wrong floor to get academic counseling services, all because we're not considering the cultural context. There are other features that I really love that we probably won't go as far in depth in, but one of them is activity names auto linking. And this is basically anytime I mention a specific activity in a course, it turns it into a link to that activity. It makes it much easier. So if I'm discussing that thing in context in a forum post or in a weekly overview, that turns into a link to the actual activity, which makes it easier for my students to find it. Another great strategy, summarizing, right? Where have we been? Really helpful to do at the beginning of courses. And one of the things that we know is that learning is really effective when we can activate prior knowledge, what they already know. So just doing a quick summary to start a class session or a meeting helps refresh people's memories, helps reduce anxiety about forgetting things. It's really helpful practice in general. And filling in those gaps really helps everyone. The last characteristic that we're going to talk about before I turn it over to Phil is consistency. And in a design context, we're talking about how do our users know where to go and what to do. But being inconsistent with those practices is really frustrating, right? We don't like when things aren't consistent. You may have that friend who, you tell them to show up at 4 and you just know that they're going to show up at 5:17 and be like, oh, sorry, there's some excuse, right? We don't like that inconsistency. It's really frustrating for us. It's also really frustrating for students. So to make your courses more consistent, I would encourage you to think about routines, habits, and systems that you can build into the course, right? Reduces anxiety, lets learners know what to expect, reminds them of where they've been. If we think about ADHD as an example here, a lot of folks think that ADHD is just oh, squirrel. It's not. One of the biggest problems, ADHD folks, they have really remarkable attention spans. Like if they are really interested in something, they could hyper focus for hours and lose all track of time. It's not an issue of attention. They have plenty of attention. The issue is executive dysfunction. In other words, the decision that you make to do something. That is incredibly difficult for folks with ADHD. I know we talked about the spoon theory earlier and how those decisions cost. One thing that's kind of gaining traction in the ADHD community is the idea of the fork theory, which is for every spoon we spend, there are a bunch of individual actions that go along with that. Most of us, if we were trying to think, okay, we're going to do the dishes. Okay, I'll get up and do the dishes. Someone with ADHD might be like, do I have enough soap? Am I doing the dishwasher or am I just going to wash my hand? After I scraped off these plates, the trash is pretty full, so I better go do that right now. So, it's a constant series of choices that go into really simple things. So simplifying those things really do help quite a bit. One of the easiest ways to do this is to incorporate weekly reminders. If you are one of the OpenLMS EDU clients, there's a built-in feature called Personalized Learning Designer that lets you pre-schedule messages to go out at different dates. And I've talked to a couple of instructors, and this seems to be a controversial sort of perspective. But I would say, sending out these messages doesn't mean that you are trying to parent your students. It just means that you are trying to accommodate for them. Right? You are trying to give them a little bit of extra help. How many of you have gotten a reminder email from your dean or chair, right? So there's nothing wrong with this. Consistency just makes those things clearer for everyone. I can give some more examples if we have follow-up questions, but we're coming up toward the end. So I just want to remind you again of what those 4 principles were. They were context, compassion, clarity, and consistency. And these are personal characteristics, but they are also design characteristics. And applying these over top of the content and the courses that you create really just helps reduce the burden of the daily decisions that your learners have to make in there. I don't know if any of you have ever seen a show called Grand Designs. But basically, this British designer named Kevin MacLeod goes to visit people who are building their own homes, and he'll visit them in January, and he'll be like, when do you expect to move in? They'll say, by Christmas, and he'll say, what year? And it's a great time. But one of the episodes of season 20, episode 3, they met with a guy named Mark Butler, who has been in a wheelchair since 1980s, and he has never, been on the top floor of his house more than, I think, 5 times. So if his daughters are sick, he can't go take care of them. If they fall and get hurt, he can't go check on them. And he was building his own house to be as accessible as possible. And he said, it's only our environment that makes us disabled. So if I'm in an environment where I can do everything, where I can get everywhere, then the disability just goes away. And I think it's interesting in higher ed, accessibility is so reactive, but there's this broad spectrum of impairments, of disabilities that we don't necessarily think of. And we can capture a lot of those folks. We can make space for a lot of those folks and all of our learners if we just embody these characteristics. within our design. Now, if you want to learn a little bit more about this, we are going to be offering an ongoing session in our training academy site. We'll put the link in the chat, but it's just bit.ly/OLMS accessibility 2022. So if you want to join our academy course, we'll go further in depth with these. With respect to time, though, I want to put up a slide and turn it over to Phil to talk about a really exciting opportunity coming up.
Michael, thank you so much for the presentation today. What a great presentation. What an important topic. So thank you for that. Round of applause in the chat. I don't know how you do that for Michael in the session today, but well done. I'm going to come in briefly. My name is Phil Miller. I'm the Managing Director of OpenLMS. And I want to share some very exciting news. We are sending out save the date messages today for our first ever OpenLMS face-to-face, Lord willing, Innovation 2022 Summit. It's going to be in Phoenix, Arizona from October 18th to the 20th. It is not just for clients, although we hope that all of our clients will be there. It's also for the community. We're not going to be selling you stuff. It's not going to be, it's going to really be about innovation and e-learning. Phoenix is great in October. If you've not been there, the weather should be lovely. And so we really want to make sure that all of you know this. Mark it on your calendars. More info is going to be coming, but we just wanted to share that with all of you today. Obviously, this will be done with all the safety concerns and all of those things. If the world circumstances change, we will, of course, adapt our things, but we want to make sure that you get this on your calendar. So the action item for you, if you're interested in getting more information, there is a hold my ticket link that will go up in the chat here in just a moment. Click on that, put yourself on the waiting list for tickets to the Innovation Summit that will happen in Phoenix in October. But thank you, Michael. Thank all of you for attending today. Stephen, are you bringing us home, saying goodbye to all the folks that have joined us today?
I don't think it's goodbye, Phil. I think it's
see you later.
No, yeah, exactly. I think it's see you later but 2 times, right? First, don't forget the eLearn Success Summit still has another session in July, on July.
Right, a virtual session. That's right.
Exactly, a virtual session. Everybody can join, and this time it's for all ed tech and data science nerds out there. So we're going to be having a lot of great people. We have the CEO and the founder of Go Student, who's going to be talking to us. That's a unicorn from Austria, out there doing tutoring. We have Al Kingsley, who's been in this industry for 30 years, keynoting for us. We have great speakers talking about, other aspects of like the no code movement within EdTech, et cetera. So come and join us on July 20th. Again, it's that same link right there, elearnsuccessseries.com. All of the tickets are free, and it'll get you signed up to watch that virtual event. But then that will also get you into the path, so to speak, of Innovation 2022, the in-person experience, and we hope to see everybody there.
All right, good. Well, great session, Stephen and Michael. Thanks again. Wonderful session. Thanks everybody for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it. A recording link will go out to everybody with a public link, so you can share this with your colleagues. But we're delighted that you're here today. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.